Hello, everyone, and welcome to Evalu8, Riverside Insight's first ever clinical conference. If you joined us yesterday for day one, welcome back. And if this is your first time joining us, welcome. We have a great week of sessions and really appreciate you taking the time out of your very busy schedules to join us for some fabulous professional learning. My name is Sarah Holman, and I'm the Clinical Product Marketing Director here at Riverside Insights. I'd like to personally thank you for joining us for our first session of day two. Before, during, and after, tips for efficient and effective assessments with the WJ4 achievement. For this session, I am very pleased to introduce Jenny Panzurek. Jenny is an educational consultant with a background in school psychology. She has also served as Director Support Services. Now Jenny can be training school psychologists on topics such as learning disabilities, including dyslexia, and the impact of attention on learning. Jenny past president of both the California Association of School Psychologists and the Ventura County Association of School Psychologists. During the presentation, please leave any questions you may have in the Q&A box. Handouts can be found in the Handouts tab on your GoToWebinar control panel. A recording of today's presentation and certificate of attendance will be sent to all registrants by the end of next week. Now I will pass it off to Jenny to get us started.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for being here, as was mentioned, during your very, very busy life. So whether you took the time out to be here still during your summer or you are already back at work, thank you all for being here. So my plan for our time together today is to talk about these three pieces right here. How can we think about, as we're preparing for an evaluation, before we even pull the student over to go ahead and administer the Woodcock-Johnson achievement, what are some things that we want to keep in mind so that we're using that time with the student as wisely as possible, right? Your time is very valuable, and I know we want the time that we're spending with our students to be as valuable as possible as well. So what are some tips and strategies that we can be thinking of before we even call the student over to the classroom? What do we want to keep in mind when we're administering the test? What are some tips and some strategies to help make sure that we're gathering information, not just was the answer right or wrong, not just scoring information, but all that other wonderful information that you get to obtain by being that person who is sitting with that student. What are some questions that you might want to be asking? What are some observations you might want to be writing down that can be really helpful, that when we are going to score this test, interpret this test, and write information down in a report to share with the parent, hopefully share in a way that other people find this to be helpful information, whether the student is eligible or not for special education. How can we utilize the information that was obtained during this evaluation to help support the student? Again, whether they're going to have an IEP or whether they're going to general education, how can we help support our students? So that's my plan. Now, I don't know if the next piece here resonates with everyone. This fall, a lot of people, I think, have a lot of different feelings swirling around about this school year starting. I am no way going to speak for every educator out there, but for myself, as well as a lot of the educators that I have been working with over the last year or so, we are well aware that the last 2.5 years have been the most interesting in our educational careers. For a lot of people who work in education, who work in special education, also saw a really dramatic increase in the number of referrals for special education evaluations during our previous school year. And I know, talking to a lot of educators over this summer, the question is that going to be continuing? Is that finally going to pause? Are we going to return to whatever normal number or percentage of referrals are? We have a lot of questions that are swirling around in our brains. And so that's one of the things that I keep in mind as I think about efficient and effective assessments, right? With whatever tools, specifically today, we're talking about the Woodcock-Johnson achievement. Depending on your state, depending on your state's rules regarding timelines, for some of you walking into this school year, you might already feel like you're walking in behind. Because for some of you, we are still working on evaluations or assessments that might have been initiated last spring. Again, every state is different. Every state has some different information in regards to timelines and whether or not timelines stop over the summer. But it can be a lot walking in and already thinking about, I have this number of assessments that I need to complete within the first 30 days, the first 50 days, the first 60 days, whatever your timelines are. That can cause some anxiety. So again, how can we be efficient so that we can get these completed in a legally defensible manner that gets us some good information about the student, right? So I like to be efficient. That's one of the things I'm constantly working on. And working in special education, how do I balance that with helping to ensure that the evaluations that we are administering, the information that we are gathering, the reports that we are writing are all legally defensible, right? It's kind of this fence. I feel like a lot of us feel like we're balancing on, I want to get this done, I want to be really efficient, but I want to make sure that I'm coming to this meeting with information that's going to be valuable to the people sitting around the table, right? And if for some reason this is going to go and some lawyer's going to read this, I want to feel comfortable and confident with the information that I have provided here. Okay, so that's kind of our plan. These are some thoughts that I know a lot of people have this fall. Again, for some of you, you kind of might feel very validated on exactly what I said. And for others of you, you're like, oh, no, we were absolutely fine last year and we are not starting off behind. And awesome if that's you. Okay, so this is going to be broken into what are things to think about before, what are things to think about during, and then what are some things to think about after. So before, during, and after, I'm talking about having the student sit across from you or 90 degrees from you, however you like to sit with your students while you're administering the Woodcock-Johnson. One of the things that you're going to hear a couple of themes, whether we're talking about before, during, or after, and one of those themes is going to be having information about why you are evaluating this individual student. As much information that you have about what is the reason for referral for this student. When we talk about efficiency, when we talk about effectiveness of our evaluation, the more information we have about this piece right here is going to help us. Now, for some of you, you're like, I know when I'm evaluating a student, I have all of this paperwork. I have all of the documentation of everything that's been tried prior to the team agreeing to this evaluation. You have a list of all of the concerns. You may have a list of data that the teacher provided in regards to all the pre-referral data that's been obtained. And some of you do not. Right? Let's just be really honest. Some of you get assigned assessment plan and they're like, you need to evaluate so-and-so and give the Woodcock-Johnson. You're like, why are we testing this kid? We're just testing that kid. So if you are in that scenario where you have all that data, I would highly encourage you, if you do not already, review that data. Read it, have that information in your mind before you're pulling the student for evaluation. If you are in that second position where you're like, I don't get anything, or I get very little, or I get minimal, or I don't get what I think is enough, if this is the beginning of the school year for you, I think this is a really great time of the year for the team to look at what's working and what's not working. I think it's a really good time of the year for the groups that sit together and are having some of these pre-referral discussions can have some of these conversations about, oh, by the way, so-and-so who is in charge of administering the Woodcock-Johnson achievement does not get information about why we're evaluating this kid. What can we do differently as a team, right? What kind of data would be useful for you to have? That's definitely one of the presentations I know that I did along with a special education teacher at one of my school sites, is we realized that we were really frustrated that we weren't getting a lot of data coming into us. People were coming to, whether you call them student study team meetings, MTSS, intervention planning team, whatever you and your team loves to call those pre-referral meetings. And we were realizing that people were coming to the meeting without the data that was helpful for us, not only to make decisions about whether or not we should be moving forward with evaluation, but if we say yes, that we have enough data to help us with the evaluation piece. So we got together and we said, well, what data would be helpful for us? Why don't we tell them? Why don't we tell the teachers? This is what data would be helpful. Do we have it? These are our expectations. Now, when we're in the middle of a school year, it can be a lot more difficult to kind of make some major system changes. That's why this could be some ideal time of the year, is to really reflect on what kind of information am I receiving? Is it enough for me to make good decisions? So what would be some examples? Of course, if someone's coming in and someone said the magical word dyslexia, or someone said this kid is struggling with math calculations, the more specific someone can be in regards to this is what the teacher's area of concern is, this is what the parent's area of concern is, that's going to help me determine which of these variety of different tests that I have access to within this wonderful tool, which one should I be focusing my attention on, right? If they just tell me you need to evaluate, we're looking for a learning disability, in what area, right? We have so many different tests to choose from. The more information, the more helpful it can be, and the more efficient I can be, so that I'm not just testing to test, right? Now, sometimes, of course, we have students that while we are looking at their academic status, their academic functioning, the real underlying concern happens to be more around motivation or attentional concerns, maybe not specifically an academic skill deficit area. In those kind of cases, if someone says, oh, so-and-so was just diagnosed with ADHD, or we're concerned so-and-so might have anxiety or depression, a lot of times we're still gathering data around their academic functioning. And so we may want to check in on whether or not we have other data sources that helps us figure out, okay, if there are attentional concerns, based on the information provided, do we happen to see more or less attentional concerns in one subject versus another? That could be helpful information, right? And it might be that we don't see a difference, but if we do, that could be helpful information as well. So I know that our teams are doing comprehensive evaluations. That's what we always want to be doing. We want to look at all suspected areas of disability. And so if you are in charge of administering the Woodcock-Johnson achievement and you do not have this information, you're unclear about why we're evaluating this student, again, I would highly encourage you to talk with the rest of the team who is, in theory, supposed to give you that information and have some conversations about how we might change some of this, right? How could we improve upon this? The more information you know as the evaluator, the easier it is for you to figure out which of these tests do I want to be administering. Now, what's something else to keep in mind in this before section as well? One of the other things to keep in mind is, for those of you who are new to a school or new to a school district, are there any district kind of expectations for academic evaluations? So what do I mean by that? I've worked in districts that have new special ed teachers, new school psychologists, whoever's doing the academic evaluation, they walk in and they say, guess what? We use the Woodcock-Johnson achievement, and we are asking you to give these 6 subtests, 8 subtests, 16 subtests. Here's our template, here you go. Okay, that's great, now I know. What you don't want to have happen is you walk into a new situation, you do what you've been doing, and you didn't realize there were some different expectations. So if you're walking into a new school, you're walking into a new district, I would encourage you, if you don't know if there are expectations, if that conversation hasn't happened at the beginning of the school year, I would raise my hand and ask somebody. I would send someone an email, right? I would want to know those things, right? Which of these tests are expected? Because for a lot of school districts, we know, of course, learning disabilities, huge area, very large area of eligibility for a lot of our states. And in our federal regulations, there are 8 academic areas that are outlined in our federal regulations when you talk about learning disabilities, right? We have 3 reading areas: reading decoding, reading fluency, and reading comprehension. Then we have 2 math areas: math calculations, math problem solving. All right, then we have writing, and then we have listening, comprehension, and oral expression. Makes up 8. A lot of districts have expectations that when we are utilizing our academic evaluators, that we are covering, either formally or informally, all 8 of those areas. Now, the Woodcock-Johnson Achievement is going to cover 6 of those areas. If you are looking for listening comprehension and oral expression tests, you would need to expand and use the Woodcock-Johnson Oral Language Battery. There are some tests in that area, okay? And what I love about this tool, the Woodcock-Johnson Oral Language plus the Woodcock-Johnson Achievement, is that there are at least 2 subtests in each of those 8 areas. That's why I mentioned for some school district, there's an expectation of 16 subtests, 2 in every area. For other school districts, they expect 8, 1 in every area, right? And some school districts may have some different expectations. I'm not here to tell you if your district is right or wrong. What I want you to know is, what are the expectations, right? And since SLD is one of the largest areas of classifications in many of our states, it is therefore being considered most of the time when we're doing an initial evaluation or a reevaluation. And therefore, what do we need to keep in mind in our district? Because I want to make sure, if I'm in charge of the academic part of the evaluation, that I'm doing my part to contribute to this comprehensive, legally defensible evaluation. Okay, so know the reason for referral, know your district's expectations. And if no one has talked to you about these, raise your hand. Raise your hand at a job alike meeting, raise your hand at a group meeting at your school site, raise your hand somewhere, right? Okay. We talked a little bit about other sources of data. I talked about it a bit at a kind of a pre-referral piece here, meaning the more data you have from these areas, it can be really helpful for you to understand, why am I testing this student, right? So I have that reason for referral is going to be as clear as possible. What are some of those other sources of data that you likely, or fingers crossed, hopefully, have access to? So some of our districts have some amazing MTSS, RTI, whatever your schools are calling it. You might have some amazing data. It might fall under universal screening data. It could be that your school, hopefully, is giving reading and math tests a couple of times a year. I always love to be able to look at that information if the school that I'm at has that universal screening information. I like to be able to understand what that information means and how the student has been progressing. And if we're using the same universal screening data, the same universal screening tool that we were using in the previous year, come this fall when everyone gives that universal screening tool, if I have information from last year, I'd love to be able to look at that type of progress. Now, one of the things that I have found, and you're going to check in on whether or not this sounds like you, this sounds like your school. One of the things, I literally was just in this conversation with a group of educators yesterday. I was doing a training and they were talking about the fact that the school had come up with a new universal screening tool, and that these wonderful educators were sitting around at these pre-referral meetings, these student study team meetings is what they called them in their district. And teachers would come in and be like, the child is at a 347, they used to be at a 221, that's their progress. They were like, I don't know what those numbers mean. Like, like, what's the context? Is that good? Like, it was better, but what were they supposed to be at? And so not only do we want people to be able to bring this kind of information to our meetings, But you, whatever role you're playing, you need to understand that information, right? So if, again, you're walking into a new school, you're walking into a new district, you yourself are like, that was completely me last year. I have no idea what our school is using. I have no idea how to interpret it. Ask some questions. Write it down in your list of things you need this year, right? One of the things that this team was talking about was in the room where they had the meetings, when we used to do everything in person, they said there used to be a chart there that gave all the benchmark information so they could quickly look at it and be like, you said a 3 what? Okay, that's where that is. Now we know. They said one of the things they realized is that since many of our meetings are still virtual to this day, that they're not in that room anymore and they don't have that chart. And they're like, I need to go take a picture of that chart. Because if you're sitting through those meetings at the pre-referral level, or you're on the other side now, we're going to be bringing the student in and about to administer the Woodcock-Johnson, I would love to know that information. I would love to know where they're at in their reading skills. I would love to know where they're at in their math skills. That type of information can be very, very helpful for me as being the person who's evaluating this student. If your school has some amazing interventions that are going on and progress monitoring is actually going on. I always say that with a little bit of interesting because I work in a lot of schools that don't have some of these things, right? I've worked in schools that have all of these things. I've worked in schools that we worked really hard for universal screenings. I've worked in schools where I have been participating in the teams to ensure that we have some amazing tier 2, possibly even tier 3 interventions. And I'm well aware of the progress monitoring tools because I was part of the conversation when we decided which ones to adopt. I also work at some schools that don't have any of these things, right? So if I'm at a school that has these, I want to know what the information is, how to interpret it, and then I want to look at it before I bring the student in. Okay, because one of the things that you're going to see when I switch here in a moment to talk about during the process is, does the data that I'm receiving from these Woodcock-Johnson scores, as I'm administering this information, does that align with the other data sources I have? So if I have other data sources, I want to look at it ahead of time. And by ahead of time, it could literally be, I take 5 quick minutes before the kid, right? I call for the kid and I look at it, right? So it's fresh in your mind as that student is walking over to your classroom so that we can take a look at some of this stuff. So that when I'm in the moment with a student and I'm like, okay, well, their reading skills are at the 3rd grade level. Wow, my Woodcock-Johnson scores are either so much lower or so much higher. This is odd, right? But the more information we have before we bring the student in, it's going to help out, because if I wait and look at this information after I'm finished evaluating the student, it could be a little too close to the meeting and I might not have enough time to bring the student back in, right? If I need to do any follow-up. So these are some of the things that I think about before the kiddo is walking into my office, okay? Why am I testing this kid? What does my data show? And what are the expectations from my district about at least what's my minimal baseline of what test am I expected to be administering? So all of those things are things I think about ahead of time. And then right as the student is walking in, one of the things I want to be thinking about here is, all right, based on all that information, what questions do I want to have answered then? Right? What do I mean by what questions do I want to have answered? It could be, okay, parents are really concerned about dyslexia. All right, so one of my questions is, how is the student doing in decoding and fluency? Good question, right? I have an active question in my brain. When we actually put questions on our brains actually seek to answer them. So it can be something that can be helpful as I'm seeking to understand that. It could be, I'm really curious about, everyone says this kid has a lot of attentional concerns. I'm really curious, am I going to see that in the one-to-one setting? And if I do see it, I'm curious if it's going to impact any of the results here, right? Those could be some questions that I have. Because one of the things that I think can be really helpful is making a list of which of the, again, there's so many opportunities, there's so many different options of different tests that you can administer within the Woodcock-Johnson Achievement Battery. You may want to list out, okay, I want to make sure these are the 8 subtests, the 10 subtests. Maybe you want to dig a little bit deeper because there's a reading concern. So I want to make sure that I'm going to give a little bit extra in that area. So I might want to write those all on down. I am notorious for having a Post-it note. Anytime a kid walks into my office, I have a Post-it note where I have listed out in some sort of order, this is what I want to make sure that before this kid leaves, or either at least through this first session, I want to maybe get through this piece. I'll write down all of the different tests that I want to administer. I cross them out when I finish administering them. And I might even put a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 and put them in the order that I'm thinking could be helpful. Then I monitor that, right? So one of the things I think about is, where do I want to start with a student? One of the things that's really nice with the Woodcock-Johnson is you don't have to start with the first subtest every single time. For some of our students, the first subtest is going to tap into something that's really difficult for this student. For a lot of times, we may want to start with the student's strengths, right? Kind of depends on the student. I know a lot of evaluators will check in with the student and say something like, you know, today and maybe another day, we're going to work on some reading and some writing and some math. I'm curious, if you had to pick one of those 3 for us to start with, what would be something that you think would be helpful for us to start with? Right, start there. I have some students that are like, I'd like to avoid reading. Can we just do math? We'll start with math. Like, we're going to have to do reading. And other kids are like, reading's really hard, but I want to get it over with. All right, that's fine. We know when we give students choices, we tend to help build their feeling of autonomy a little bit, right? Now, we do get to do a little bit of mixing on the order of the test, but we do have to remember there are some specific guidelines within the Woodcock-Johnson. There's flexibility, but there's some structure within that flexibility. So for example, many of you are aware that there is a fluency test for reading, a fluency test for math, and a fluency test for writing. 3-time tests that are part of this tool, and we do not give all 3 of them back to back. Right? So those kind of things we want to keep in mind, right? We try and keep some variation between the subjects too. We try not to do everything math, right? So again, I didn't ask the kid, what are all the tests you want me to start with? What's the one test you want me to start with, right? Giving them a little bit of choice, but I got to make sure that I'm still following some of the standardization pieces as well, okay? So some things to be thinking about there. All right. When I am evaluating a student, I have to say there is so much extra white space on the protocol page. I remember my my very first supervisor. He told me it has all this white space and you're supposed to fill it up with notes. You're supposed to fill it up with observations. That's what he told me was the purpose of all the white space on protocols. Now, I know for some of you, I have worked in very litigious districts. I have worked on very litigious cases. I have worked in spaces where people are a little concerned about writing down every thought, every observation within the protocol. You know what? Have another piece of paper next to you, right? But I think it's really important because sometimes students do things during the evaluation that is going to be very helpful for you to remember when you are writing up the report. And a lot of times, and I do this too, I'll be like, I'm totally going to remember this. And then I don't, especially when I'm testing kids back to back. I get a lot of things going on. I always think I'm going to remember. And I have to tell you, with every year passing in my age, it gets harder and harder. So I try and remember, actually, Jenny, you're not going to remember that. Why don't you write that down somewhere? Why don't you write down that really great observation somewhere? So sometimes I'm writing observations down as I'm going through. Sometimes I'm writing observations the moment the kid leaves my room. I typically will have a piece of paper and I'll just have some general observations, like how easy was rapport? Were they able to answer my questions that I asked them along the way? Was there anything interesting that I remember? A lot of times during the evaluation, though, is when I'm writing down the observations that may be something that was interesting during that subtest. Now, I also like to ask questions sometimes. Now, you don't want to ask questions that are going to ruin standardization, right? You don't ask questions in the middle of a subtest. So it may be, some of the questions may be at the end of a subtest. A lot of times we give kids breaks. I might have a quick question before we go on a break. A lot of times I'll save questions to the end of that session. I know a lot of times we don't finish up all of our testing in one session with students. So I have a variety of different times that I do it. I just don't do it in the middle of the test. So a lot of times students will do something interesting. unique. For those of you who have given the Woodcock-Johnson a couple hundreds of times, every once in a while you have that kiddo where you're like, I've never seen that before. I have never seen anyone ever do that before. I would suggest you write it down somewhere. That's an interesting thing. So what might be an example of that? I had a teacher, and this was really important for interpretation pieces. When the student was doing math fact fluency, the student was erasing. Now, you're allowed to give a child a pencil with an eraser. So it was allowed. The kid kept erasing. Now, this is a timed test. The kid scored really low, but he got all the answers correct. But when you just looked at the score profile, when you just looked at the information that came out of the Riverside Score program, it looked like the student had some difficulties with his math facts. Nope. So what did the teacher do? The teacher at the end of it said, I noticed you were erasing a lot. Why? Can you tell me a little bit about that? So what the student shared was that his teacher was working on him writing really, really neatly. And his teacher was teaching him to erase a lot. Now, I have a lot of thoughts about that, but that was a good explanation of what was going on. And that needed to go in the report because the child did not have math fact fluency concerns. He was like borderline perfectionistic qualities going on, right? Kind of teacher induced in this kind of case. That's going to be helpful because I don't want someone else reading the report without that information in there. They're going to think the child needs a goal in math facts. The child does not need a goal in math facts. He knows his math facts. I love to ask questions about what was the easiest thing for you today? What was the hardest thing? I usually say that for the end of that session. And sometimes I might even have to remind them what we've worked on. So I might say, if you remember, like when you came in, I had you read a list of words for me, and then you solved some math word problems, and then I had you write some sentences. Out of those three things, what was the easiest thing for you? What was the hardest thing for you? I just like that information. I'm curious about that. I'm curious on how they felt about that, right? Sometimes I might ask a question about what could I have done then to make that task easier for you? Could be an interesting one. Now, sometimes they say things that you are not going to be able to do. I wish you would have told me what all those words were. All right, well, I'm not allowed to tell you in the middle of passage comprehension what those words are, but okay, all right, that helps me out. All right. Sometimes I might check in with students and ask them about, is this something that happens during class as well? So I was evaluating a student, and during the writing test, she just seemed blocked. So especially when it was just kind of like, write a sentence about this, right? When there was a picture prompt, it was a little bit easier for her. When there was no picture prompt, when those started getting taken away in writing samples, she was an older student, she just sat there. We sat there for a long time. I said, does this ever happen to you? Does this ever happen to you in school? Yeah. When does this happen for you at school? When the teacher gives us a creative writing piece. If the teacher gives me a really specific prompt, I'm able to do it. But when it's write about anything you want, I cannot think about that. I'm like, all right, so what happens? What happens then when that happens for you in school, right? Obviously you turn something in. Well, my mom has to brainstorm with me at home. I can't get it done in class. I have to take it home. My mom sits down. She comes up with a couple of ideas. We pick one of them and then I'm fine. And then I can write it. And then she can write a beautiful, however many paragraph it was meant to be. So am I seeing something during this evaluation session that actually is something that mimics what's going on in the classroom? Or in some cases, it might not, right? It could be that this testing session is producing a lot of anxiety for the student, and the anxiety from today is interfering, and the kid is completely fine in school, right? That could be there. So a lot of times I want to ask questions like that. Now, motivation is a question a lot of us have about students we are working with. So I like to ask some scaling questions for kids where I am concerned that motivation might have come into play a little bit. So I might say on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 to 10, how much effort did you give today? With 5, like the most effort I've ever given, and a 1, absolutely none. A lot of students are pretty honest with that. If we're at the end, a lot of students, not every student, but a lot of our students are really honest with that. I had a student where we were doing the math calculation task together. Well, he was doing it, I was watching him. And at the end of the task, I noticed like he skipped over some problems that in my head, based on other problems he could do, I was kind of wondering why he just skipped it. So it was done, right? We were finishing up and I said, can I just ask you a quick question? Like, why did you skip this one? I noticed you skipped this one, right? Could be a nice way of putting it. I noticed you skipped this one. He was like, yeah, there's too many steps involved. He's like, I know how to do it, but in high school, I have a calculator. So I don't do that by hand anymore. And there was like a couple multi-digit multiplication problems he had skipped. And so I said, could you just pick one of them and do it for me so that I can see that you actually do know how to do the steps? And he was like, okay, like he'll do one for me. Now I can't score it because that wasn't standardized or anything like that. But one of my questions is, does he have the skill level, right? Or was this a motivational piece? For him, he just wasn't going to give forth full effort. That was way too many steps, right? Is that something I heard from his teachers? Absolutely. Is that something I heard from his mom? Absolutely. So I got to see that as well, right? What are some other things I might be writing down? I had a kiddo talk a lot about math. I had a student where we were doing the math problem solving task together. We were doing applied problems, not timed, right? A lot of the tasks we have are not timed. So after giving an academic test so many times to different students, you start to get a sense of how long it takes ninth graders, fourth graders, seventh graders, first graders, whatever grade you tend to work with, kind of you get a sense of how long certain subtests are going to take, right? Because sometimes we're looking up at the clock and we're like, ooh, the bell's going to ring in 10 minutes. So-and-so's almost finished. I got 10 minutes. Which test am I going to put next, right? Because I might not have time for this one. So I had a student working in my office. I'm looking at the clock and we were working on applied problems. And in my head, I was like, oh, we're going to be able to do 2 more things after this. And then we kept going. And then we kept going. The student was working out all of these problems and getting them right, but was taking forever to get them done. And I just kept looking at the clock and I was like, all right, so we're not going to do that. We'll just do one more thing. Nope. You know what we did? We finished applied problems. That's all we got through. That needed to be notated down. That is something I don't want to forget, that while this was untimed, this student took longer than most of my students, right? Does this help explain why it takes her forever to get homework done and why her parents are complaining about that? Yes. Does this help explain why in the class she can't get her classwork done on time? Yeah. But you know what? She knew the right answer. That was also the important piece there. She was getting it correct. So what was I able to come to the meeting and say? This student has great problem solving skills. She has persistence, right? Perseverance. And she's able to actually do the math correctly, but she's going to need some more time. If we want her to finish, we either need to give her more time or less work to do, right? If she can show mastery a little bit earlier, it just takes her too long to get through this. And otherwise she's going to spend hours and hours on homework, right? Okay, during the evaluation, think about ahead of time. Which test do I want to be administering from the Woodcock-Johnson? What order do I want to be putting these in? What types of things do I have to remember? So when I'm still doing it in standardized fashion, we can't do all the fluency tests in a row. What kind of questions? You might jot down some questions, especially for those of you who maybe haven't been asking questions in the past. You may just want to have some general questions. And then again, as something interesting comes up, you might want to ask that random question as well. But the other thing to be thinking about is as you're going through and evaluating this student, if you are noticing that your results are very different than what parent, teacher, other data sources are indicating, this may be an opportunity to do a little bit more evaluation or ask some more questions from the teacher or look a little bit deeper at that pre-referral data that we have, right? We do not want to wait until the day before the meeting to do that kind of examination, because it's at that point where we're like, wow, I got very different scores than what's going on over here, right? So as we're going through the process, I think it's wonderful that right there in the protocol, you are able to count up those raw score points and put that circle on that table that's on the side of pretty much every page in our protocol and get a general sense, right? You get a general sense with age equivalence and grade equivalence. We tend to focus our attention a lot more on standard scores and percentile ranks. We need to use the software program to get those, but you can get a good general sense as you're wandering through the protocol before you open up the Riverside Score program. All right, speaking of the Riverside Score program, let's talk a little bit about, okay, now I think I am done evaluating the student and administering the standardized tests. What are some other things to think about? One of the things, if you have a bunch of assessments that are going on at the same time. So for some of you, you are involved in a lot of initial evaluations throughout the school year, plus you may be involved in a lot of reevaluations. Sometimes, again, it depends on who's administering this test within your school district. I have some teachers that are in charge of doing the academic evaluations for their own students. They have a very small group of students in their class, and they only are involved in reevaluations. They literally may have 1 or 2 evaluations the whole year. Other special ed teachers that I work with have 35, 40, 50, 80 evaluations they're doing in a year, right? So you got to kind of figure out which group you're part of. If you are doing multiple, I like to batch my scoring. What do I mean by batch? If I need to use the manual to score, so for example, for writing samples, you have to use the manual to score. That test is not intended for you to just be like, sounds like a 2. No, we're supposed to look at the criteria, right? We're supposed to look at the criteria. If you are testing 3 kids in 1 week and you have the time frame to do it, I would save the writing samples scoring till the end of the week, until I'm done with the 3rd one. And then I only have to pull that manual out once. Now, why do I suggest that? I suggest that because what we know about our brains is that it's hard to constantly switch between tasks. And if I'm in the mode of scoring, writing samples, it's a lot easier for me to do the first protocol, the second protocol, than the third protocol. And that way, versus I have to do it on 3 separate days, your brain's like, all right, where's Appendix B? All right, which ones are we doing? It takes a while for our brains to kind of get into a task. So if I can batch it, it's actually more efficient for my brain. Okay, so if you're doing 1 or 2 or 3 evaluations the whole year, that's not going to work for you. Okay, so for those of you who are doing multiple evaluations and might be doing multiple evaluations when we come back to school, maybe something to think about if it works for your timing. Same thing with using the Riverside Score software program. If you have to, instead of opening up 3 different days in a row, open it up on 1 day. Score all 3 of them, right? Your brain just kind of goes, all right, this is what we're doing. It's so much easier once you do the first one, the second one, the third one, rather than having to spend the extra time to open it up on 3 different days. It really, truly is more efficient for your brain. So if that works for your timing, you might want to try it out for this year. Okay. For those of you who are like, I've never even thought about doing that, it might work. Try it out. See if it works for you. See if you notice a difference. Just try it on. Want to also share with you, there are some wonderful free webinars that are available. If you have not touched the Woodcock-Johnson Achievement in a while, for those of you who are new to this tool, if you're newer to this tool, and you want to remind yourself about some of these important pieces around administration, you may want to take some time to take a look at some of those webinars. They have a great webinar reminding us about basals and ceilings. They have a great webinar that talks about the complete page rule that applies to some of the tests within the Woodcock-Johnson Achievement, but not all of them. So if some of those things you're like, oh yeah, my brain could really use that as kind of kicking off this school year, I would highly encourage you to go ahead, take a look at their the Riverside Clinical PD page. It's going to have a lot of wonderful information there. A lot of great information there. All right. I said there was a couple of themes, right? One of the themes you have heard me talk about multiple times is our standardized assessment data, right? Our Woodcock-Johnson scores. How do those scores align with our other sources of data? We know that our federal regulations say we never make decisions based on single scores, right? We're always looking at multiple sources of data. If I'm going to go into a meeting and my information sounds very different than what the parent concerns were or what the teacher concerns were, I kind of want to work through that either on my own or with the rest of my assessment team, so that when we go into the meeting, I can say, I got these results. This is why I'm thinking they're different, right? It's okay that it's different. The question is, why is it different? Right? And sometimes I can figure that out on my own. Sometimes I need to have some conversations with other people. I want to make sure I have time for that, because I don't want to walk into the meeting without having some sort of reason, right? I like the why, right? Are my results contributing to understanding this reason for referral, right? Always keeping that in the back of my head. One of the things that I am constantly working on and still going to be working on this school year is trying to figure out how to make my reports as parent-friendly as possible and how to make my verbal explanation at the meeting as useful, as helpful as possible, right? This is something I continue to work on. I think there's always room for improvement. So even easily as I'm going to talk about the academic results, one of the reasons why I am going to be, one of the reasons why I did this evaluation, or this portion of the evaluation, is, as we know, we have concerns about Johnny's reading skills. So I wanted to take a look at his reading skills. And when I look at his reading skills, I wanted to look at how well he can read individual words, how quickly he can read, and how well he can comprehend what he can read, right? If that's the reason for referral, I want to tie that in as I'm explaining my results verbally. It kind of reminds them, instead of just, sometimes I feel, and this is even how I feel about when I'm presenting information, I feel sometimes at our meetings, it's like I talk and then you talk and then so-and-so talks, and then at the end we're like, and this is what it all means. Trying to figure out how to get some more of this is what it all means in the explanation of all of these different evaluation results. So, picture on the page, ducks in a row, that's how I want to feel walking into a meeting, right? I want to feel like myself and any other assessment team members that are school side of the meeting here, that we have our ducks in a row. Even if we have some disagreements, that we have some understanding about some of the whys, and that we at least are on the same page about some things, right? That it isn't in the middle of the meeting that someone all of a sudden is saying something, right? Never like those moments. I try and avoid those moments. Okay. So I mentioned I'm working on my verbal explanation. One of the other things I'm always working on is my report writing. And this is something I've been working with families and working in special education for over 20 years. And when I think about my first reports and I think about my reports today, I'm very excited about my improvement, but I still think there is room for improvement. I know that there are legal requirements in our reports, and your districts may have a whole list of legal requirements for reports. We love to put scores in our reports. I love to put some scores in the reports. I love some qualitative descriptors. I love percentile ranks. I love putting all of that information in there. But one of the things I always think about is what would be useful for a parent for me to add to this information. So Riverside Score, depending on which access to which reports you have some really great interpretive reports that will go through a lot of the information after all you do is put in raw scores. However, the Riverside Score program doesn't know all those interesting things that you saw during the actual evaluation process. Those are the things that I think can be really helpful to enter on in. So what are some things that are helpful? For me, if I'm talking, I've been talking about math a lot, so I'll continue on that conversation. If I'm going to come in and say, this is your student's standard scores on the math calculations, the math fact fluency, the applied problems, that is some good information to have, but what else can I tell you about that? Can your student add and subtract? Can your student add and subtract with regrouping? Did your student attempt problems, right? Like, remember my student who would not even attempt a multi-digit math problem, but afterwards, after being prompted, showed that he could do it. That's important information. That's useful information for the entire team, especially when we're trying to figure out, is the student eligible? And if they are eligible, what are areas of needed goals, right? Or accommodations. So the more information that you can add into the report, I think can be really useful, not just for yourself as a good reminder about what happened during the evaluation process. And oh yeah, you should probably know about this because this helps understand this score a little bit better. But I always trying to think about what would be helpful for a parent to read, right? If I was sitting on the other side of the table. Now, if I was sitting on the other side of the table and someone said, I gave letter word identification and the score was 75 and that is in the blankety blank range, all right, I know what that means, right? In my background. But you know what else I'd want to know? I'd want to know, did you notice any error patterns? Right? All the errors that the student made, they got a 75. Did you notice any error patterns? Right? What would be some useful information? So one of the things to think about, if this is not something you already do, is what could be some additional useful information to put into your report alongside all the other wonderful information we can get from the Riverside Score program, that we can get from a variety of different sources. How can we integrate all of that together so that somewhere in our report, we're really helping the reader understand, what did we learn about your students' reading, writing, and math skills? What did I learn if I also use the WJOL about listening comprehension and oral expression, right? I love, and I will tell you at the beginning of my career, I was all over those standard scores. I love to talk about them. Working on more and more, what does this all mean? What does this all mean for you, parent? How much of this is in alignment with what you shared with us at some of these pre-referral meetings? I love doing those tie-ins. I love those moments in meetings, right? Where you're like, this is the score that I got. This is exactly, guess what, parent, exactly what you were sharing with me beforehand. I remember being at that meeting and you said it takes her forever to do her math homework. When I was giving applied problems, I saw that too. I completely understand what you're talking about now. She took a really long time to do it. But like you mentioned, she got them all right. Yeah, so we're going to talk about how we want to help support her, because it's not a skill deficit. It's actually just she needs more time to think it through it. I love those moments when we get to connect like that, right? We're able to bring in those other data sources. I love those moments, so I try and put those, as many as I can, into my report, as well as many of those opportunities I can in my verbal explanation at the meeting. Those are things I love to do. I love when I have those moments. However, I also have those meetings where we're super rushed and we might not have had all those times. We might not have been able to check in with one another before the meeting. I don't like those meetings. I don't like those feelings I have going into the meeting where I'm not quite sure what everyone's going to say. So as you are at this beginning of the school year, what a wonderful time to be thinking about what worked for you last year, what didn't work for you last year. If you were feeling super rushed, if you were feeling like some of the things that I'm talking about today, you're like, we didn't even have time to even talk about that. We have time to align data. We didn't have time for those collaborative conversations. Well, let's think about how we want to look at our calendars, look at our schedules for this upcoming year. How do we want to add that in? What could we do? I love the beginning of the school year. The end of the school year, great time to reflect, but we're also exhausted. Beginning of the school year, if you can still remember last year, you can think about what worked for you last year, what worked for your team last year, what didn't work for your team. Are there some other things we want to put in place? Or how I like to talk about it, are there some things we want to try, right? We may say, let's do it this way, and then we find out a couple weeks in, that doesn't work either. That's fine. We just said we were going to try it. So a lot of times what I'll say to a team, all right, this is our reflection. Sounds like we're all on board. We all want to try this thing out. How about we try it for the next 60 days? All right, we're going to check back. I'm going to put on my calendar for our next consultation meeting. We'll check in. Is this working or not working? If it's not working, I don't want to continue doing stuff that's not working. Do we need to tweak it or do we need to abandon it? Those are the types of things I want to be thinking about. All right, I think I tried to leave a couple extra minutes for some questions. And there are some additional resources, of course, on the Riverside Insights websites as well. And so I just want to say thank you all for being here once again. I know all of you are super busy. I hope you found some of the tips and strategies, useful things to maybe try on, or for some of you felt super validated today. You're like, we do that. We do that. I love that, right? Love those moments too. But I will open it up to see if there are any questions that came up in the chat.
Yeah, so we do have several questions that came through. The first question says, do others struggle to determine if the school psych or the speech language pathologist should assess for oral expression and listening comprehension?
That is a question I come across in a lot of school districts. This is my take on it, and if your team is struggling, I would suggest taking my take back to just start a conversation about it. I think someone on the team needs to look at those areas. In my mind, our speech and language pathologist, if they're looking at language, they're looking at listening comprehension and oral expression. Like, that's what they do. That's what their tools are utilizing. That's what they're looking at. So if I feel like that is being examined and someone could point to our comprehensive report and say, oh, look, those two things were examined, then I don't know if I want to go out of the way and be overly redundant. I don't like over testing. So that's a take that I have taken. We have literally written flowcharts on who does it and based on what. So sometimes it's an SLP is involved, yes or no. Sometimes it's, I mentioned the WJOL. The WJOL, those same tasks are also used in a lot of districts for language proficiency purposes, because 3 of them are in English that also have parallel versions in Spanish. So again, if they're already being used in that way, we don't need to give them again, right? So we kind of talk about, well, what about this type of student? What about students that have these people on their assessment team? And we've kind of talked it out and talked it through. Someone needs to do it. In my mind, someone needs to.
Excellent. And I would like to take the opportunity to remind attendees that on Friday, we will have a more interactive session with Jenny talking about sort of best practices. And that's a forum in which you can come and get some of these questions answered and maybe get the take of some additional practitioners that are joining. They're going to be over Zoom, which is a little bit more of a interactive platform and allows a bit more participation. So just a reminder, those that are interested, that's another opportunity to sort of get a feel for what others do in certain situations. Those are available for registration on our website as well. I think we have time for one more question, and that is, why should the fluency test not be administered back to back?
That is a great question. I didn't know if anyone from Riverside wanted to respond to that, because I know that's something that's indicated in there. I have my own take on it, but I didn't write the manual. Does anyone from Riverside want to talk about that, or I can throw in my 2 cents?
I think it'd be perfectly appropriate for you to share your take on the question.
So one of the things to be thinking about, they're all timed tests. And in comparison to a lot of the other tests that are not timed, obviously there's a lot of requirement for very focused attention for the student. And so to go from a 3-minute test to a 5-minute test to a whatever minute test, all in a row, is a different level of requirement than spreading them all out. And so I don't believe it was normed with having all 3 of them right in a row. So focused attention, focused attention, focused attention. You might end up being evaluating something else. Meaning you could, instead of looking at math fact fluency skills, you may actually be testing the kids' focused attention skills. So spreading those out will help ensure that as best as possible, that we're trying to evaluate the academic skill and not just the focused attention skill. That's my 2 cents.
Excellent. Okay, so we do have a few other questions, but since we're sort of at time, we will make sure that we follow up with Jenny and get some additional questions answered. And again, take the opportunity to join us on Friday to bring some more sort of best practices or practice questions. Thank you so much, Jenny, for your excellent presentation and information that I'm sure was very valuable to all of our attendees. We are very excited to get started with our second session, but just give us a brief moment to get everything situated and we will get started back up.
Right. Thank you, everyone.